99% of people get to use bad tools or don't have any tools at all. That's OpenAI COO Brad Lightcap, and it's the most grounded reason I've heard for being optimistic about AI. Welcome to X-Pulse Digest. This comes from Jack Altman's podcast Uncapped, where Brad talks through what the last 8 years inside OpenAI actually felt like, and why the next wave isn't chatbots, it's systems that go do work. Also, his Codex use case is extremely practical. Back in 2018, OpenAI was still a research lab most people hadn't heard of. Brad joined at 27, coming from Y Combinator, where AI sat in the same bucket as fusion and satellites. Promising, hazy, maybe real, maybe not. What pulled him in wasn't a single demo. It was a property researchers were starting to see over and over. Make models bigger, and weirdly, they get better, in a way that's predictable and consistent. The part that matters is what that implies. If that trend holds, progress starts to look less like a string of lucky breakthroughs and more like an engineering and compute problem. Brad is careful about his own confidence there, basically saying he wasn't qualified to judge whether it would keep working, but he was qualified to recognize the bet. If the scaling pattern keeps paying out, it's not just another startup story. It's the most important thing ever. That's the kind of sentence that makes a 27-year-old stop optimizing for a comfortable career. The early job, day-to-day, wasn't build a consumer app. It was, what do researchers need so they can move faster? Sometimes that meant raising capital and designing supercomputers with partners. Sometimes it meant unglamorous logistics, like robots breaking and parts taking too long to ship from some supplier in a small town. That's a useful correction, because from the outside, it's easy to imagine a clean line from research lab to ChatGPT to global product machine. Inside, the research culture didn't get replaced, it got proven. Research still drives the whole thing, and the product era was built on top of that foundation. Then you hit late 2022, and the question becomes, did it feel inevitable that ChatGPT would take over the world? The answer is no. But it also wasn't random. It looked like sparks, lots of them, just not a bonfire yet. Here's the detail that explains a lot. Early language models were treated like completion engines. You start a text string, the model continues it. That's the mental model. But the people using OpenAI's interface kept trying to turn it into a conversation anyway. They'd type in a prompt, then respond, then prompt again, forcing a dialogue format onto a system that wasn't explicitly built for dialogue. The demand signal was sitting right there in behavior. People didn't just want better autocomplete. They wanted to talk to something. At the same time, there was DALL-E, the first image model. Brad says it wasn't very good by today's standards, but it was a breakthrough. You could see consumer-style adoption of prompt in, output out. So there was a strong guess that a chat experience would matter. The part they missed was scale. They were doing compute planning and took guesses. Brad's guess was that peak would be 1 million concurrent users. That's not a small number, and it still ended up being wildly wrong. The world didn't just show up, it piled on. Brad frames OpenAI's story as tracking the industry's story in chapters. First was the scaling period, where things went from unusable to broadly usable across model formats, roughly 2018 to 2022. Then came the chatbot period, 2022 to 2024, where generative AI became mainstream, but it wasn't always clear what it was for. Useful, new, Sometimes a slightly better version of search, but still, early on, true utility. Now we're in what he calls the agents period. Systems that run asynchronously. You give instructions, and they can take an arbitrary amount of time and tokens to think, use tools, and come back with work done. For him, that chapter starts around December of 2024 with the release of O1 and runs through 2025 into 2026. The twist is that the diffusion cycle is slower than the innovation cycle. Even if progress stopped today, he thinks there's still a 10 or 20-year cycle just to get these capabilities into the economy and to let people actually explore what they can do. With agents, he suspects it could take longer. So you end up with this strange dissonance. The tech keeps leaping forward, and the world is still learning how to use what already exists. Something funny happened after ChatGPT. The public conversation started in sci-fi land, new species, Dyson spheres, all of it. But as the software got better, the conversation got more commercial and more down-to-earth. It starts to feel less like a looming metaphysical event and more like, in Jack's words, insanely sick software. Brad calls it a paradox. The closer you get to the sci-fi future, the more day-to-day it feels. There's a local linearity when you're living inside the steps. Even when the capability jumps are enormous, your brain adapts fast, and novelty lasts about 3 seconds. And still, you get these moments that are hard to file under normal software. Brad mentions a story about a guy in Australia trying to cure his dog's cancer. No biology background, as he understands it. The guy used GPT-5 to propose an RNA-based vaccine approach, worked with a lab to design the treatment, and it seemed to be working. Brad says it happened for around $3,000 and in a matter of weeks. That's where the two tracks coexist. The same technology can help lawyers be more productive and also give an individual person the power to do something that used to require a full institution. It's both. That's the uncomfortable part and the exciting part. If you want a concrete place where fear shows up fast, it's coding. If AI gets great at software engineering, does that mean fewer engineers? Brad's answer comes from basic supply and demand. If you drive the marginal cost of engineering toward zero, the naive conclusion is software engineers won't exist. But often, when something gets cheaper, demand explodes. And in reality, the job just changes. Instead of hand-typing every character, people guide agents. There's also a bigger claim underneath. Software is wildly underpenetrated in the world, and not just in quantity, in quality. Brad points to the experience everyone has had with bad systems, like the archaic software behind a hotel front desk, or the systems hospitals and power grids run on. He even calls that the real risk surface, brittle software in critical institutions. So, in his view, AI that can write really good, safe software is one of the greatest gifts to the world, because it could harden and modernize the stuff we all depend on. Then he drops a very current data point from inside OpenAI. Model improvement cycles are collapsing, which is why you see rapid jumps. He cites GPT 5.4 as a few days old and already doing a $1 billion run rate in revenue and 5 trillion tokens a day, and being the most dominant API model at that moment. The point isn't the scoreboard, it's the pace, and that pace is what makes the next part feel inevitable. Software doesn't just get cheaper, it becomes easier to create, rewrite, and throw away. There's a product critique buried in all this that felt unusually candid. Users still have to do too much work. Brad describes the current consumer experience as this weird gap between the promise of intelligence and the reality of fiddling with settings. Model pickers, thinking fast mode, pro thinking hard mode. His vibe is basically, it's time to move on. What he wants is for the model to allocate intelligence for you, efficiently, without you managing the token budget like you're doing cloud cost optimization. His own behavior is interesting here. Codex has replaced ChatGPT as his daily driver, and he's not a software engineer. He uses it to collapse timelines inside a fast-growing company by getting a first version of everything. A very real example is recruiting. Building a forward-deployed engineering team is hard, and recruiting is hard. He took a list of around 200 names and told Codex to find their public presence, read what they wrote, and score it against the technical elements of the job. It wrote the program, crawled the profiles, and came back with ranked candidates. It surfaced 3 or 4 people he wouldn't have picked from a spreadsheet, and it compressed what might take a busy recruiter a couple weeks into something closer to a short loop. That's what agents look like when you strip out the buzzwords. Not a chatbot with opinions, but a system that goes and does the tedious middle steps. Brad's optimistic thesis is surprisingly simple. The time from idea to something real in the world starts collapsing toward zero, and the cost of creation drops with it. If you believe people are innovative, and that most people have been stuck with bad tools, then better tools don't just automate jobs, they unlock whole categories of work. You can hear that worldview in how he talks about startups, too. Don't build directly under the rock where the model labs drop the next capability. You'll drown. Build on the outer ripples where new capability makes previously impossible, underserved problems finally solvable. And stay close to users, because no model release substitutes for actually knowing what people need. Even his reflection on Sam Altman points the same direction. Internally, Sam prefers a huddle of 5 people talking about some niche technical future, thinking on a decade-plus timescale, while the world thinks in quarters. The mismatch creates whiplash, and then everyone adapts anyway. If AI keeps shrinking the distance between "I wish this existed" and "it exists," what happens when the person with the wish is basically anyone? For the full conversation, find OpenAI COO Brad Lightcap on Uncapped with Jack Altman.